Thanks for coming. I'm going to pretend that we all still have energy, even though it's the last talk of the day. So my name is Einar. I'm here to talk about what I call the AI puppet theater, or the AI puppet dance, rather. I'm a Norwegian software developer, and as a disclaimer, these are my opinions and not necessarily those of my employer. I guess when you reach a certain age, you start saying stuff like that. So I'd like to start by sort of talking about how we frame the discussion about AI. And the reason is that I think it's often framed very poorly, and that leads to poor discussions or no discussions at all. And the typical framing is this sort of like binary opposition, right? Are you for or against AI? And it reduces this really complex issue into a single bit and divides the world in two in the process. And at that point, we're no longer really talking about the issues, but rather sort of like classifying people. We're creating teams. And the motive for that cannot be to discuss the issues better. And because language works the way that it works, words come with connotations, which is why we can describe the exact same divide using different words. And each pair of words are sort of-ish perceived as synonyms for and against. So are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about AI? Are you happy or are you a cranky person? Are you courageous or are you cowardly? Are you fast or are you slow? Are you part of the future or are you part of the past? Are you part of the solution or are you going to be part of the problem? And this kind of binary framing is about determining tribal membership. So what's your clan, right? And I think, to be honest, this is sort of like below us as humans. We pride ourselves at being sort of the thoughtful one among the apes, but this binary framing at creating oppositions is more primitive than that. And the question, or the purpose of this talk is to raise this question, and this is one of those rhetorical questions, right? I mean to imply that the answer is no. I do not think that we are facing artificial intelligence with the best of our own human intelligence. So, quick agenda for this talk. First, I'm going to talk about and challenge some narratives that shape our sort of like perceptions and actions concerning AI. Then I'm going to talk about hype and reality concerning investment and especially return on investment in AI. I'm going to talk a little bit about the application of AI to programming and whether or not we can expect one of these magical silver bullets. Then I'm going to talk about some of the harms that are associated with the current AI hype, and then I'm finally going to share some resources that have sort of influenced my thinking about these things. But first, we have to ask a fundamental question, and I mean this is an earnest question: are we idiots? And the reason that I want to ask this question is that we seem to be asking a lot of idiot questions. And when I say idiot, I mean it sort of like technically, in the same way that the Norwegian philosopher Lars Svensson uses in his book. If you speak a Scandinavian language, maybe you understand what this means. So it's dumhet, idioti, og dumidioter, which means roughly stupidity, idiocy, and stupid idiots. And Svensson distinguishes between stupidity, which he claims is ignorance, lack of knowledge, and idiocy, which is bad thinking. And my claim, then, is that there are a lot of questions out there about AI that are the product of bad thinking. And we should sort of dismiss those questions so that there's room for asking better, more intelligent questions, if you like. So, for instance, is there anyone who is wondering now whether I'm personally for or against AI? I'm not going to answer that. And the reason for that is that it's an idiot question. Right? I don't want us to behave like idiots. I think it's below our dignity as humans. So whether or not I'm personally for or against AI, completely irrelevant. And it's also very badly defined because AI isn't one thing. So it's sort of like asking whether or not someone is for or against technology, which is also a stupid question, or an idiot question, rather. Same goes for this question. It's another idiot question. Is AI good or bad? Why? Because again, AI is a million different things. Let's see. Yeah. And many of those things have good and bad sides, right? So as well as ambiguous sides, where it's kind of hard to tell whether or not it's a good thing. And again, to reduce that to a single Boolean is something that only idiots would do. So let's not spend our time on this question. Is AI hype or useful? I think this is another idiot question. It's not one or the other. It's perfectly possible to be wildly overhyped and at the same time useful in certain contexts for some problems. This is a false dichotomy, and false dichotomies are for idiots. Has AI come to stay? This is an obvious idiot question. Again, AI is a broad field, right? It has, like, we're talking about 60 plus years of research and development. There are a lot of systems out there in the world today that fall under the AI umbrella that have nothing to do with the current AI hype. And they are integrated in society. Obviously, they're not going away. So why are we asking this question? This makes this an idiot question as well. Is AI a flop? What about this one? Is generative AI a flop? This is a little less obvious, or I'm going to argue that it is. Depends on what you mean by a flop. So if you mean that it will be gone in 3 years and no one will ever sort of do anything with generative AI anymore, then obviously that's wrong, and it's an idiot question. No one thinks that, right? If you mean that a lot of people are going to be sort of like disappointed or maybe lose some money, then we'll see, right? And we have been disappointed sometimes before. This is why we have concepts such as AI winter and AI spring. Right? But okay, AI is badly defined. What are we really talking about? And I think we're often mixing different things together, and that's not good if our goal is to think clearly and to ask good questions. So first, AI as a technology. As a field, it has existed since the 1950s when it was coined. The concept was coined by John McCarthy. There's been a lot of research on different approaches. And in a sense, the fact that AI has been badly or poorly defined has been a benefit for the breadth of the research. It means that a lot of things have been able to sort of fall under the AI umbrella for a long time. Now, of course, the current hype is primarily generative AI, and then sort of with artificial general intelligence sort of lurking in the background as a tantalizing promise, something that we want. What about AI as a concept? And it's important to understand that sort of like intelligence is an abstraction. It's not an essence. It's not a physical quantity. So when we talk about intelligence, we're really basically just pointing in the general direction of some human behavior, right? And some shared human experience that we have. That's all. And it means that intelligence is sort of like interwoven and connected to all these other things, like consciousness and thinking and planning, that we also do, right? So they are just symbols that we use to generate associations in brains. That's not so much a problem when we're talking about human intelligence, because we are similar enough as humans that when we point in the general direction, it's sort of like, it's roughly the same, right? Even though we have very coarse-grained words, and the abstractions are not so easy to define, we're still pointing at the same mess inside all of our heads, right? And that means that relationships and sort of the richness of the real world remains. When we start to talk about artificial intelligence, we're shifting to using intelligence as a metaphor, right? And we're pointing to an entirely different mess. And that means we don't have the same relationships, and we're losing the richness and the interwovenness that we have in human intelligence. And that makes this an idiot question as well. Can we make a machine that's smarter than humans? Since intelligence is an abstraction, not a physical quantity, the comparison doesn't make sense. A much better question to ask is, what tasks that humans apply their intelligence to do could we have machines do, maybe in ways that are faster, cheaper, better in some way? Right? So, to understand AI as a phenomenon in the world today, I think to understand this whole AI wave, we sort of must look at the narratives that surround it, that are used to describe AI, and the stories that people tell. And the first narrative that I want to bring up is the revolution narrative. And this is the idea that AI changes everything. Whenever people say AI changes everything, I sort of look around and I say, really? There are a lot of, from my perspective, there are a lot of things, almost everything in the world is sort of like untouched by AI. Right? So when I take a walk in the forest, I don't see a lot of things that are affected by AI. Of course, unless you're an AI doomer and you think we'll all be sort of like or exterminated in a few years' time, the fundamentals of life will remain the same. And it also goes for a lot of different kinds of work. Say you're doing like garbage disposal in a large city or something like that. You can probably optimize things a little bit with machine learning and maybe be clever about traveling salesman algorithm or something like that. But ultimately, someone or something will have to do sort of the physical act of collecting your garbage and putting it somewhere, right? You could probably have robots do that if you wanted to, but it's sort of like the problem to be solved is almost the same. So if we're going to be honest, we sort of have to sort of scale it back a bit to moderate ourselves a little bit and say maybe that AI changes many things. And even that's a bit premature, right? Insisting that the change is already underway is another narrative. It's more like wishful prediction than reality just yet. So it's more correct to say that AI will change many things. And as we become more precise and more honest, the sale pitch sort of gets less impressive. Like AI is likely to change some things within certain domains. I feel sort of confident that this is probably true, right? But I understand why Sam Altman uses the other pitch. Right? And then there's the train narrative. I'm sure you've seen this. This is the idea that the metaphorical train is leaving the station and we need to hurry on board, right? And it plays on this fear of getting left behind. Now, it always seemed funny to me that it's always this metaphor with the train leaving the station. It's never the Titanic heaving up anchor, right? So we don't know what this voyage is going to be, right? But somehow it's a train, and I guess that feels safe because you have rails and stuff. But we don't know how this is going to end. But what does it communicate? It communicates a sense of urgency. There's no time to think and ask questions. We must act. And there's sort of like this grand irony that at the same time that we're fawning over artificial intelligence, thinking machines, it's apparently incredibly sort of like backwards and boring and cowardly for humans to do any thinking. And to be honest, again, I wonder what the rush is. Now, say you're providing something like healthcare for the elderly. What's going to happen if you don't do anything with generative AI for the next 3 years? What's going to change? It's very hard to understand why you sort of have to do something today. Yet everyone is scrambling for an AI strategy. So what happens if we just wait? Not everything has to be on the bleeding edge. And one thing, a benefit of not being on the bleeding edge is that you bleed less. Right? So whenever I hear this train narrative, I think of this cartoon strip. I grew up on Lucky Luke, so this is the speed. It's the speed that will conquer this rugged country, and he picks up his hat and then he sort of moves along. Another narrative has to do with sort of like the faith in the next version narrative. And the idea here is that since everything is progressing at breakneck speed, a very fast-moving train, any problems that we have today are not really problems at all because they will be solved in the next version. And if it's not solved in the next version, then it's going to be fixed in a version after that. But again, this doesn't necessarily seem to be true. I mean, if you think about self-driving cars, it's like turning into a joke these days. But sort of like progress has more or less ground to a halt. We've been like a couple of years away from fully autonomous level 5 self-driving cars for like a decade. Right? So it's not necessarily true that next version will fix all the problems. But it's connected to this extrapolation narrative. And the idea is, and the claim is, that development in AI is going to be either linear or superlinear. So ideally exponential, but at least linear, right? So it's going to keep climbing. But very few technologies actually follow that curve for a long time. It's much more common to have quick initial progress, and then it sort of levels out. Even Moore's law is sort of like broken, even though we're sort of trying to pretend it's not. It's hard to argue, I think, that I mean, GPT-3 was a tremendous leap forward. Was GPT-4 exponentially better than GPT-3? Is GPT-5 exponentially better than GPT-4? I think it's hard to argue that it was. It's also worth remembering what we are plotting. What are we plotting in the case of AI? Is it intelligence? But intelligence is an abstraction. It's not an essence. It's very, very hard to say that something is twice as intelligent as something else. I mean, it's easy to say it, but it's easy to have it mean anything. Like, What does it mean to be is a human twice as intelligent as a cat? You could say that, but what does it mean, right? Same goes for other candidates. Capabilities, powers, perhaps. All of these are abstractions. Right? So we can only ever be arbitrary. Then there's a brainiac narrative, which is kind of amusing, really, which is this idea that there are very intelligent people working on AI, the smartest people in the world, and people are that smart cannot possibly be wrong. And I like to call this the Sheldon Cooper argument, right? But the history of the world is full of intelligent idiots, right, who engaged in very bad thinking. And in fact, research suggests that high IQ people are susceptible to being blindsided by precisely this bias. Because they're so used to being right, because they're so smart, it's very hard to imagine that you could possibly be wrong. And there's the narrative of general artificial intelligence, which is sort of like a backdrop for discussion about generative AI. And it's not really a narrative, it's more of a claim, right? It's stated as axiomatic truth that artificial general intelligence is only a few years and is actually a bit scary. And this is very important, because this is sort of like a guarantee for continued progress in AI in general. Right? So you have this self-reinforcing feedback loop where what you can do with generative AI tools today increases our faith that we'll have artificial general intelligence, and then the sort of idea that we will ultimately have this increases our faith in what our Gen AI tools will be able to accomplish. And finally, there's the singularity narrative. And the main proponent for this idea is the futurist and transhumanist Ray Kurzweil. And the idea is that if we could create a machine that is smarter than us, whatever that means, then surely that machine, which is smarter than us, should be able to create an even smarter machine. And then you have sort of like ad infinitum, right? Because then you have infinite intelligence, basically. And this is the kind of thinking that treats intelligence first as an essence, and then is determined by a mathematical model rather than reality. But these narratives, then, are not independent. They reinforce each other and paint this picture of inevitability, and this is very important. And I think we should do more to challenge them. And I've been using the word narrative here, but that's a bit too generous and perhaps a bit naive, a little too innocent, because it's not just stories. They are really radical declarations that are aimed at constructing reality, right, by presenting them as axiomatic truth. And it's really remarkable. So if you read posts about AI, how often it's going to start with one of these declarations? Right? AI is revolutionizing this or that, or changing the game or something like that, which is a declaration rather than observed fact. What it is really marketing. And it's incredible how successful this marketing has been and continues to be. It's very ironic, because large language models has been sort of described as stochastic parrots, and we seem to be the parrots who are repeating what we've been told. A much better approach for engaging with emerging technologies is through Neil Postman's 7 questions, which are from his lecture on culture's surrender to technology. First is, what problem does it solve? And it's very important not to be naive when we're answering these questions. For instance, we might think that, well, artificial intelligence promised to solve all kinds of problems. A very different perspective is that it solves the problem of wage expenses for employers. Right? Whose problem is it? Again, that depends on what we perceive the problem to be. And then what new problems does it create? And this is something that's very rarely discussed, because we look at the primary effects and very rarely at the secondary and tertiary effects. So if the problem being solved is wage expenses for employers, then it seems likely that it will follow that this is going to create a problem of unemployment for regular people, and also for society at large. And ultimately, I guess, the problem of fewer customers for those who would like to eliminate wage expenses in the first place, because everything in society is sort of like connected. Which people stand to be most impacted by this new technology? Are these the same people who stand to benefit from them? We have seen, and yes, which shifts in economic and political power will result. We have seen sort of like a tremendous accumulation of wealth and power in very few hands over the last decades. And the current wave the current AI wave is a continuation and radicalization of that process. And what unintended uses will it have? And we'll sort of return to that towards the end of the talk. Okay, so let's start digging into the hype and reality of the current AI wave a little bit. And I'm not going to really argue that our AI is a hype. I'm just going to show you this picture. And it's an indication, I think, of hype when the advert focuses on the fact that it has AI rather on sort of the actual improvement. And it's also interesting to note that there is no real way to revolutionize the brushing of my teeth. Like, I have a stupid toothbrush, which is a stick with a brush on it, and it does an adequate job. When I go to the dentist, everything is okay. So there's no room for radical improvement here. And this is a bit amusing, but I'm genuinely concerned about the effect of this hype on our free will as humans. Because it may not matter whether or not sort of you buy into the hype, you may have to play along, right? Because unless you go all in on AI, you may risk losing out in the struggle for resources and attention, right? It forces people to put sort of like an AI spin on everything they do. Even if there's not really much room for AI in there, you sort of have to pretend that there is. Otherwise, there is no attention to be had and no funding to be had. But okay, so how much should we invest in AI, or basically any technology, but now we're talking about AI. And I guess it depends on the expected returns. And this is where the singularity narrative is very, very important, right? Given that we're if we are able to create artificial general intelligence that is sort of like super intelligent, smarter than humans, and we start this recursive process, it means that we have infinite intelligence, and that's a bit like inventing magic, because then you can sort of have technological solutions to all the world problems. You can have cold fusion, you can cure cancer, you can reverse aging, and so on and so forth. And that means that returns are sort of like infinite as well. Now, when you have infinite returns, you don't have to be modest when you're talking to investors, right? Even like pure, like Scrooge McDuck numbers will pay off, because they're still finite numbers. So infinity is a bit like a conjurer's trick, because it tips all the calculations in your favor. Right? Even there's a very small chance of something with infinite returns happening, it's still infinite. Right? You have a small number, you multiply it by infinite, you have infinite. It's much harder when the returns are not infinite. And there's a problem, because the world isn't infinite. And there are no infinities in the real world. It's like a mathematical concept. And then you have to start talking about like unpleasant things like opportunity cost. Right? What is the cost of doing this and not something else? What is the opportunity cost of the AI hype? There are a lot of problems that we know how to solve today if we could get like attention and funding for it, but it's hard to do these days. Yes, let's see, this works. Now, if you look at these claims that AI is revolutionizing everything from programming to brushing your teeth, what does that entail? Right, so what qualifies as a revolution? Right, is it 10 times better, faster, cheaper, or whatever it is that we're sort of trying to quantify? Or is it sufficient to have twice as good? About 1.1, 10% improvement. At this point, it's harder to talk about revolutions. Right? What about this? I mean, improvement is good. I'll take 1% improvement if everything else stays the same. Of course, this would be disappointing then, but we'll see. But what is the revolutionary change? The obvious candidate is cost. Right? If you can produce something much faster than before, it's going to cost less. We may also be able to produce a whole lot more of something, and I think we're seeing a lot of that, basically. This could be good up to a point. At some point, we may have enough of any particular thing. Quality is a bit of an unknown, I guess. It could go both ways. It depends on what it is. Could be better, could be worse, could be roughly the same. Could be hard to tell. For instance, is like stable, okay quality better or worse than sort of like high quality with really abysmal quality in between? Right? So it depends on sort of the problem that you're solving. How sort of the quality breaks down is a factor as well. Now, I was on the NDC Oslo Agenda Committee a couple of years ago, and we noticed a flood of these like synthetically well-formed but sort of like vapid abstracts. It was a 30% increase in the amount of abstracts from the year before. And these AI-generated abstracts competed sort of like poorly. And that wasn't because they were AI-generated abstracts. It was simply because they were not as good as the best handwritten ones. And the competition for NDC Oslo is kind of fierce. So you can be in this weird situation where you have something that's really quite impressive and sort of like decent quality, but not good enough for the sort of use case that you're looking at. And I think we're seeing a lot of that with generative AI. And this is sort of like related to what I like to call the sand in the sandwich problem, because like generative AI tools famously hallucinate, which is what we call it when they produce output that we don't like, as opposed to output that we do like. And this has to do with whether or not it matches some state in the real world. And this is sort of like an unavoidable consequence of the underlying architecture. It's not something that can be thoroughly or completely eliminated. And that means that we have basically two options, and we're trying to do both at the same time, I guess. We can try to reduce the amount of sand, obviously, and the other one, the other strategy is to get used to sand in your sandwich. Right? And this is a fundamental constraint. And that means that really generative AI tools should only be applied to tools where you tolerate some sand in your sandwich. Right? If you need perfect sandwiches, you should be using something else. But of course, it may be that you're, in your context, willing to accept some amount of sand in your sandwich if it's fast enough to make and really, really cheap. If you can get sandwiches almost for free, then maybe you'll take one with sand in it. And it may also be that you're forced to accept sandy sandwiches because that's the only thing that's on offer. That's a different scenario. And this seems, for instance, to be the reality for subtitles for videos these days, where the new norm is like automatically generated subtitles with glaring errors in every video. Right? And this is not only like online on YouTube, but also from broadcasters. There's sort of like tremendous economic pressure that is degrading our notion of quality or acceptable quality. And this, I think, we should be expecting more of. Now, this here is an example from a couple of days ago. And this is the national anthem for Norway, being transcribed by AI on TV2 in Norway. And in case you don't speak, so it says, elsker, elsker deg, deg for faen. If you don't speak a Scandinavian language, this text here goes, love, love, you, for fuck's sake. And that's not in the anthem, right? Now, what's really interesting is, this is sort of like amusing, but what's really interesting is the aftermath, because so far, no one has said that this is unacceptable. No one intends to change anything. It's more like the new reality. This is just the way things are. Let's hope, fingers crossed, there will be less sand in the sandwich next year. Right? So they will be continuing to do this. What about the application of AI to programming? Now, this is a big one. Now, in 1986, there's this famous paper by Fred Brooks called No Silver Bullet as an Accident of Software Engineering. And it argues that we can't get to sort of a silver bullet in software development unless it addresses the sort of underlying essential complexity of programming. In the paper, Brooks defines a silver bullet as an order of magnitude improvement in productivity, in reliability, and simplicity. And he doesn't actually state if he means like and or, right? If it's sufficient to have one, or if you need all of them, right? That's sort of like ambiguous in the paper. But this is the 10x scenario, right? So we have to wonder, could generative AI be a silver bullet for programming? Now, what are we talking about? 10x what? Now, if software development were like hauling bricks, then 10x productivity would be sort of all we needed, right? If you can move the bricks 10 times faster from here to there, then you're done, and you have the same result, then we're done. Now, there are a lot of important ilities when we're building software, right? And these were basically just the first ones that came to my mind when I made this slide. I'm sure you could come up with more important ilities. What happens if you have 10x for productivity? Each developer now produces a whole lot more code. It's a very interesting scenario. Of course, you can think, maybe AI can help with more than productivity. Right? If so, the question is how much, and the answer is we don't know. We don't know for productivity either, so it's really like this. Right? So we're having, well, it's not the same x. It's going to be different x's for the different entities. Right? But we do know that the theory of constraints tells us that the bottleneck is likely to move to the weakest chain, or the weakest step in the process, which means that we basically, if we want the 10x scenario, or the silver bullet, we're going to need 10x for all the entities, for the 10x in productivity to matter. Otherwise, we sort of risk this situation that what we hoped would be a silver bullet is more like a silver boomerang. Right? And I think, at this point, only time will tell. And there are a lot of people making sort of like grand statements of what has already happened or is going to happen in next year or going to happen in a couple of years. But I think the truth is we don't know. So when people do that, sort of pause them, hand them a Ouija board, and says, now you may continue. Right? But my prediction is that we're about to have, or in the process of having, the greatest lesson in systems behavior that the world has ever seen. And the systems that we're talking about are always larger than we think. And we like to think about the software system in isolation, but of course they have to work in the real world, because we create these systems to have effects in the real world. We don't just want to build stuff, we want it to have an effect. And ultimately, it's us humans who have skin in the game, right? We build systems that will influence the lives of humans in some way. And for AI, it's ultimately a game of numbers. Right? It may be a very sophisticated game, maybe a very interesting game, maybe the kind of game that will sort of lead to a Nobel Prize if you invent it, but it's still a game. And ultimately, it doesn't matter for the AI whether or not it's correct. And it's all sort of like nicely summarized by this cartoon. Right? The problem is that it will have real-world effects, which brings us to harm. So we looked at ways in which expectations may be overblown. Now we turn to a little more like the harms of the current AI wave. And it's important to note that the harms are not necessarily inherent in AI as such, but they are properties that we're observing it with the current AI wave. We could be envisioning something with very different properties, something much more benign, but unfortunately that's not what we're seeing. Our first and obvious harm is environmental pressure, the high consumption of energy and resources in a world that's already very hard-pressed for energy and resources. You have energy consumption, carbon emission, water usage, extraction of rare minerals for GPUs. That extraction may involve human exploitation, child labor, slavery. This is a terrible but huge topic, and I can't sort of give it full justice in this talk because I have much other things I want to talk to as well. But this is a very big one. But it's also important in a different way, which is the declaration of intent. So you have the direct harm to the environment, but it's also clear from the actions of the tech giants that they have no interest in contributing to a transition to a more sustainable consumption for the world. Right? It's very clear that they will try to grab as much energy and resources as they possibly can to scale, and that should have some implications of how we sort of deal with the tech giants. We are looking at the destruction of livelihoods. Basically, in principle, everyone who performs a task that produces data that is then used to train a model with the intent of then having a machine perform the same task or parts of that task is sort of like in some potential trouble. Obviously, creatives, these are the people who make things that make life more interesting, I guess. Journalists, this is sort of like attacking the livelihood of those who would ideally be spending their time helping us distinguish facts from lies. I guess that was already on the decline before AI, but this is accelerating. Right? Then we turn to sort of like us, programmers. We'll see if it's a good idea to fire programmers or not, but of course executives will act on bad ideas. And there is this sort of, I think we're seeing a distributed global experiment to see whether or not it's a good idea to fire programmers. Now it's important to notice that whenever someone says that the technology frees up time so that you can spend your time on higher value tasks. That's a dog whistle for layoffs. That's what you're really talking about. That's the intent, because remember that the problem that AI is solving in the eyes of executives are wage expenses. And so when someone says, then the doctor will have more time to spend with their patients, no, they won't. Right? They're going to cut the budget for doctors. That's what's going to happen. There are going to be fewer doctors. We'll see some of this, of course. We trained this dog to talk. It doesn't actually understand language, but it kind of sounds like it's having a conversation by mimicking the sound of human speech. And then the CEO goes, awesome, I find my entire staff. How quickly can I start diagnosing medical disorders? And some of the people who make very bad decisions based on sort of like this kind of thinking may live to regret their decisions. But it's not going to be a whole lot of help for those who lost their jobs. Now, there's no real I told you so here. So if I'm hit by a bus and then the bus drives off a cliff, I'm not going to be chuckling from my grave. I'm still run over by a bus. Right? There's overproduction. So the big selling point, we sort of talked about this with quantity, the big selling point for generative AI tools is productivity. And this quickly leads to overproduction. Right? As cost and effort to produce an artifact approaches zero, we produce a whole lot more artifacts than we can meaningfully engage with. And it's very easy to generate much more output than anyone can interact with in their lifetime. And this applies both to sort of like work settings and outside of it. Right? At work, you will have overzealous enthusiasts that can sort of generate a flood of memos and demos and reports that no one will ever look at. And it looks like it's producing value, but it's really sort of like choking people. Right? It quickly becomes a denial of service attacks because you cannot do anything else than sort of like coping with the output. And the bad part is that sort of the actual valuable content sort of drowns out in the flood of content. So how do you sort it? And there's this. The trouble is not so much AI making you more productive, but that it's tripling the output of the biggest idiot where you work. Right? So the least critical people will be cranking the lever the most. Right? Unfortunately, as we turn to malicious applications, unfortunately, it's very easy to envision malicious applications of generative AI, actually much easier than benign ones. And it's sort of like unfair, because for a malicious application, any success at all makes the effort worthwhile. Whereas for a benign application, you need to be successful all the time. Right? And people complain when there's sand in your sandwich. Malicious applications, it's sort of turned on its head. In a sense, lying is the killer application for generative AI. It's sort of what it does because, well, it has no notion of truth, so it's all about plausibility. So it lends itself perfectly to producing plausible lies, if that's what you want to do. So we'll see a lot more sophisticated and plausible scams. It's going to be very difficult to believe what we actually see in here unless it sort of happens in front of us in the real world. I think AI-generated videos may never produce movies that are worth watching if you have sort of like more than a quarter of a soul and a quarter of a brain. But it's more than good enough to create plausible footage of anyone in the world, including sort of your loved ones, doing any act you like, including the most heinous crimes or admitting to anything you like. Right? It's more than good enough to do that. We can look forward to tailor-made disinformation based on your your activities, detailed, intimate information about your life. It also obviously also applies to propaganda. And it's not just sort of like this could possibly happen. This is happening. This is from October last year. It was a deepfake video of one of the candidates in the Irish presidential election that supposedly withdrew from the election just a couple of days before the election was going to sort of be held. So this deepfake video went viral on Facebook. There were a lot of people watching it. Commenters believed that it was true. And this stuff will have enormous consequences. And we'll see more of it because it's going to work. It's going to actually influence things. All of this is going to undermine the very notion of truth. One thing is that your campaign may be successful, but it will also be successful in sort of eroding your sort of notion of truth, that truth can be had. So sort of indisputable facts will be ever harder to come by, and they will be drowned out by this flood of possible facts. So you'll sort of be forced to choose your own truth, even if you don't want to, even if you sort of want to be neutral and sort of educate yourself. It's going to be hard to find reliable sources of truth. You have to choose what you want to believe in. And that's hard because all of us are sort of like biased. And even if we try our best, it's hard to be neutral. There are some things we want to believe in and some things that we don't. Of course, this will lead to increased polarization, destabilization of society, which will pave the way for sort of so-called like strongmen and fascism. And we see this is happening. And then there are the dystopic applications, of which there are also many. Here's an example. Should an AI copy of you help decide if you live or die? Now, obviously, the correct answer to this is hell no, what is wrong with you? But the idea here is to train an AI copy of you on your personal data, ideally like harvested many years in advance. And then if you should end up in a coma, they don't have to ask your relatives, they can just ask the AI clone. If you can ask the chatbot if you should turn off the machine, right? Now, this sounds ridiculous, but it's important to remember that people who are in this situation are sort of in a desperate situation. They would like help to get out of that situation. So they might resort to something that they will live to regret. This is also happening, or has happened. Robin Williams' daughter, who tragically lost her father to suicide, is apparently receiving a flood of AI-generated videos of her father that neither he or she ever consented to. So they're basically animated his corpse against her will. And of course, he cannot protest either. And I mean, people are doing this because they can, I guess. So that was the dystopic application. There are simply poor applications too, and these, at least initially, are more like amusing. So this here is a picture used by Nes kommune in Norway, Nes municipality. It is to promote a service for families. Now, if you look closely, you may notice something weird. So I've highlighted it here. So if you didn't see it, neither did Nes kommune. But there is half a baby on one of the plates, and the others are having spaghetti. And then I think there are two identical clones on the right, but that's less striking. So the big problem here is the half baby. So they published an updated picture, which removed the baby, but kept the human clone, I guess. And here you also have some of these scary artifacts. You're not supposed to zoom in on the faces, because that's sort of like the stuff of nightmares. You also have the classic problems with the fingers and hands. But of course, these things will improve over time. This picture probably looks better today. Right? There might still be half a baby, I don't know. What's not going to improve so much, I think, is what you can call output blindness. In fact, that might be getting worse the better the service gets. Because it's this phenomenon where you don't really check, right? Because you're so happy that you got something that superficially looks okay and satisfied your demands, that you don't actually see the flaws, even when they are quite glaring. So you saw it immediately, yet Nes kommune did not. How come? And I think it's a feature of our brains. There's something that is sort of like switched off, even if we don't notice it. Even when we think our brains are on, they're really off. So we're not sort of like taking in the information. This spells trouble for proposed workflows where sort of AI tools generate and humans verify, because we're not very good at that. We are much better at constructing something that's sort of correct in the first place. And that seems to be a necessary precondition for engaging our senses in our brains, right? And with that backdrop, I sort of have to say a few words about human in the loop, which everyone is talking about, because, of course, we're going to be responsible. We'll keep a human in the loop. And I think human in the loop is a cop-out. Right? It's a way to diffuse our worries about processes that are being automated with AI. Don't worry, a human will ensure that the output is correct. But it's not going to work because humans are bad at verification. right? And they're bad at tasks that they're disengaged from. There is no reason to assume that just because we can do a task, we'll also do well in this sort of like white-collar quality checkpoints along this sort of like knowledge work assembly line, where you're supposed to be like, oh, whoa, is this good? Is this good? Is this good? Humans are pretty good drivers if we are immersed in the driving, right? That doesn't mean that we'll automatically do well if we're supposed to sort of break out of our inactivity to override an autonomous car that is just in the process of making a terrible mistake, right? We're not going to succeed at that. That's a very different thing to ask humans to perform. In fact, I think human in the loop is sort of like an inhumane setup, because we'll be torn between impossible and irreconcilable goals, which is efficiency and safety. And the entire point of the automation is efficiency. That's what we're going to be measuring, right? And we're not going to have the efficiency benefits manifest if the human keeps slowing down the process, right, by intervening. So in a sense, the human must be present and absent at the same time. I think the human in the loop is basically a hostage and a responsibility sink. Right? It's a way where you can sort of place the responsibility. So the only function it can have is as a scapegoat if and when something actually goes wrong. And I think mostly it's a diversion tactic to end discussions about safety and to ensure that the AI-enabled process will be put in place. And then we can optimize it afterwards. Now, sometimes poor applications of AI are not just like amusing, they can lead or influence policy decisions. There are multiple examples in public sector in Norway where AI has produced reports that contain glaring hallucinations with like false references and stuff like that. And it seems basically that there is sort of like no cross-learning here. Every municipality has to make their own mistakes. And that way, poor applications become irresponsible and harmful. Now, talking about harms, we may be facing the death of the web as we know it. There is this, it sounds a bit alarmist, but there's this something called dead internet theory, which is this sort of like conspiracy theory that says that the internet has actually been dead for 10 years. And it's all generated contents and bots. I don't think that's true, but I think maybe that's where we're heading. And it is true that sort of like the original amateur web was largely dead 10 years ago and was replaced by walled gardens owned by big corporations. That is true. But as Google moves towards like AI-generated responses instead of sort of search results, third parties will be cut off from internet traffic, which will reduce their revenue and sort of disincentivize them from creating content, putting content on the web. So basically, Google is creating its own walled garden and cutting off the oxygen from the rest of the web. Overproduction is poisoning the web as well. The percentage of sort of so-called AI slop is rising. We can see this at sites like Pinterest, Instagram, LinkedIn, drowning in slop. And it's unclear to me how long there will be a human sort of like audience for this stuff. Now, on LinkedIn, you can get AI help to write your blog post, and you can get AI help to respond to other people's blog posts, or like LinkedIn post, I guess. And that's completely ripe for automation, right? So why keep a human in the loop? Right? You can just automate engagement. So a bot can certainly play this game, right? And ultimately, it's going to be hard to distinguish bots from humans. I think we'll find, as humans users of these services, that playing the Turing game every day of every week is going to suck. Then there's privacy. And I think privacy is really too small a word for what I'm talking about. What's really at stake is the concept of individual integrity, or the ability to have any sort of like personal agency at all. Now, I want us to pause a little bit, and then we can ponder what's the worst idea it's possible to have in sort of like in the world, the really worst idea we could have. Now, here's one of my candidates, sexting with Sam Altman. I would not do this. It's not that Sam Altman isn't hot. I'm sure there are people who find Sam Altman hot, and that's fine. But the idea of sort of like, now what I really mean is like talking dirty to ChatGPT or whatever, right? And the idea of sharing, that kind of stuff with OpenAI or any tech company is like, hell no, let's not do that. It's always a two-way transaction, right? And you don't know what your interaction with that service is going to be used for, or who they're going to share it with. But I think that's actually just the second worst idea you could possibly have in the world. The real worst idea in the world is to give Mark Zuckerberg access to your retina. Because it's important to realize that we're talking about a man-in-the-middle attack, right? It means knowing what you're looking at, how long you look at them, what keeps your attention, what makes you look away, all these things, and also the possibility to interfere, filter, and inject information to influence your behavior, right? And it's not just Facebook doing this. Everyone wants to put a wearable device on you, right? So you can talk to it all the time. And the goal is to be involved in everything we do, every second of every day, every second of every night. There's a reason also why Google bought Fitbit, right? They want to know your pulse. Why do they want to know your pulse? So when we're sort of assessing whether or not that's a good idea to share this kind of information and to insert a man in the middle on your retina, it's important to remember what the sort of like the business model of these companies is. Is it to sell ads? It's much broader than that, right? It's to sell influence. It's to modify opinions and behavior. That's what people are sort of paying for. Now, if you take use cases like this, increase sales of something by some percent, change public perception of something by some percent, or move some percent of voters, these are all the same thing. This is the same use case. These are just different customers who will pay for the same thing. Now, you may say that it's not in ChatGPT or not in Claude or not in whatever. Not yet. It's definitely coming in sort of like Google's Gemini AI responses that replaces searching. But we've seen the patterns. We know what these companies will do. This is the process known as enshittification. First, they will try to attract users, and we're seeing how aggressively they've been pursuing users. Right? Then they will try to sort of maximize their value for their customers, and those are the ones who are paying for modification of opinions and behavior. And then they will turn to sort of like maximizing short-term profit for shareholders. And we don't have to wonder if this is going to happen. Right? We have 20 years of experience of this, or evidence for this pattern. Ever since Google launched Gmail for free, and everyone was like, whoa, Gmail, email for free. And then started analyzing our emails without consent and using that information to sell influence as a service. We know this is what they do. And that should make us think really hard about what we want to share with big tech companies, given that we know what we know. And given also that we know that this information can be shared with government agencies, and that these tech companies respond to US law, not necessarily the laws of your country. Right? You cannot assume good faith or good intent. Given that every interaction is an act of surveillance, and every interaction is a leverage point for influence that someone can bid for. And this seems to be a good point to sort of circle back to this question, are we idiots? We'll have to ponder that one, I guess. So resources, these are some books that I would like to recommend. First is Artificial Intelligence by Melanie Mitchell. This is a nice overview of the field that covers much more than just generative AI. A good starting point for knowing about artificial intelligence as a field. There's The Intelligence Illusion by Baldur Bjarnason, who has read more papers on AI than I ever will. And it's great for the list of references alone, but it's also for the clear-headed analysis. And you should follow Baldur on social media. There's AI Snake Oil by Naranjan Kapoor. They are AI researchers. They are aiming to distinguish hype from reality with respect to what AI can and cannot do, and is likely to be able to do in the future as well. For instance, they are very skeptical on anything that has to do with like prediction, right? Predict future events. That's not something that they see happening very easily. As Computer Power and Human Reason by Joseph Weizenbaum. This is the author of the original ELIZA program, which was the first chatbot that convinced people that there's someone there, right, who understands me. And he was pretty horrified at that because it was a simple computer program. And he basically spent the rest of his career talking about this and warning about this. And many of his thoughts are just as relevant today, if not more so. There's On Bullshit by Harry Frankfurt, essential reading in these days of infinite bullshit and bullshit-generating machines. There's The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Gould, which discusses different attempts through history at measuring the intelligence of people, typically in the name of scientific racism. In case you're interested in other parts of sort of the tangled mess inside our heads, besides intelligence, I recommend this book by Daniel Dennett. This discusses the abstraction that we call consciousness. There's Neil Postman's Technopoly, which is a great resource, and I think everyone who works in technology should read this book. The same goes for Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. If you want to understand the business models of Google, Facebook, and the other tech giants, you need to read this, and it will give you some great tools for thinking and talking about these issues. And I think the final book is More Everything Forever by Adam Becker, to understand some of the quite outlandish ideas that many of the most influential people in Silicon Valley sort of entertain. And there's this potent combination of essence and infinity that does a lot of heavy lifting in the minds of these people. And it's good to know about that. Yes, I think that's it. I'm just going to leave this by Baldur Bjarnason. It says, critics keep talking as if it's useless, but it isn't. It's cheap, and even though it has some flaws, it's extraordinarily effective at some of its use cases. So what? Are we supposed to accept all the downsides of LLMs just because it's occasionally useful? LLMs? No, I'm talking about asbestos. So if you like this one, you should follow Baldur. Well, thank you.